The room went quiet the moment my son raised his glass. Not the kind of quiet that happens between songs at a party when people are just catching their breath. This was different. This was the kind of quiet where 60 people suddenly forget how to move. Forks stopped midway to mouths. Conversations died mid-sentence, and I sat there at the end of the long table, watching my son smile at his in-laws like I wasn't even in the room. He said, "I want to thank everyone who made this happen. My wife's parents, who treated me like their own son from day one." He paused and looked directly at me. "And I want to acknowledge my father, who was, let's be honest, more of the financial contribution than a real presence in my life." Laughter from a few people who didn't know better. Nervous silence from those who did. I didn't move. 34 years as a civil engineer, most of them spent reading blueprints in silence, while everyone else panicked around me, had taught me that stillness was not weakness. Stillness was precision. You don't respond to the earthquake. You wait for it to stop, then you assess the damage, and you rebuild. Or you don't. I set my wine glass down very carefully, and I looked at my son. He was already looking away. Let me go back to the beginning, because none of this makes sense without context. And I've learned that context is everything. My name is Roger. I'm 63 years old. I live in Burlington, Ontario, about 40 minutes outside of Toronto, in the same house I bought in 1998, when the market was sane and a man with a steady income and no inheritance could still afford something with a backyard. I raised 2 kids in that house, my son Darren, who is now 34, and my daughter Leanne, who is 31. Their mother, my ex-wife Sandra, left when Darren was 12 and Leanne was 9. She didn't leave for another man, or at least that's not how she explained it. She said she'd married too young and wanted a different life. I didn't fight her on it. I got a lawyer, we divided everything cleanly, and I raised the kids. I want to be very clear about that, because it matters for everything that comes after. I raised those 2 children alone. Not with help from a nanny, not with a rotation of family members. My parents were in Nova Scotia and Sandra's family never offered. It was me, a rotating schedule of after-school programs, a neighbor named Mrs. Petrov, who sometimes let them in when I was running late from a site visit, and a lot of evenings spent helping with homework. I barely understood myself by the time they hit high school. I coached Darren's hockey team for 4 years. 4 winters of 5:45 a.m. Ice times in arenas so cold I could see my breath for the first hour. I never missed a single game. Not one. I have the photographs to prove it. I'm not saying I was a perfect father. I was tired a lot. I was distracted. There were stretches where work pressure meant I was home by body only, not by mind. But I was there. Every morning. Every night. Every report card. Every school trip permission form. Every orthodontist appointment. Every single one. When Darren was 22, he met a woman named Gwen. Gwen's family, her parents, her older brother, her grandmother. They all lived in Mississauga, and they were very close. I mean close in the way that some families are, where Sunday dinners are mandatory, and every life decision gets run past the parents first. I didn't mind it. I'd never had that, and I thought it was good for Darren to be around people who operated that way. What I didn't see at first was that Gwen's family had a way of absorbing people, not viciously, not with bad intentions. They just expanded to fill every available space in a person's life until there was no room left for anything that had existed before. The first Christmas after Darren and Gwen got serious, they went to her parents' place for dinner, not mine. I found out when I called to confirm what time he was coming over, and he said quietly, "Dad, I think we're doing Christmas with Gwen's family this year." I said okay. I understood. I cooked for myself and watched the Leafs game and told myself it was fine. It kept happening. Easter, Thanksgiving, his birthday, which her family started celebrating on a weekend that worked for them, leaving me with a Tuesday evening dinner at a Swiss chalet on Main Street where Darren checked his phone twice while we were talking. I noticed. I didn't say anything, but I noticed. When they got engaged, I offered to help with the wedding costs. I want to be precise here because my son later told people I threw money at problems instead of being present, and I want the record to be accurate. I did not throw money. I sat down with Darren at my kitchen table, the same table where I used to help him with grade 10 math, and I said, "I'd like to contribute. What do you need?" He told me they were looking at venues and that a lot of places in the area were running between $15,000 and $25,000 for a full package. I told him I could put in $20,000. He said thank you. He seemed genuinely moved at the time. 6 months later, when the bills came in and the venue they'd chosen in Niagara-on-the-Lake was closer to $35,000, I added another $8,000 without being asked. I also paid for the rehearsal dinner, just over $3,000 at Outration in downtown Burlington, and I bought Gwen's engagement ring because Darren came to me and said quietly that he'd found the one she wanted, but he was short, and could I cover it? It was $4,400. I gave him the money in cash from my savings account the same week. In total, I put just under $36,000 into that wedding. I'm not telling you this to make myself sound generous. I'm telling you because my son stood up at that rehearsal dinner and thanked his future in-laws for making this dream possible, and thanked Gwen's brother for being his best man, and thanked his grandmother for flying in from Vancouver, and then looked at me and said, and thanks to my dad for chipping in. Chipping in? $36,000. Chipping in. I drove home that night and sat in my car in the driveway for a long time. I called my daughter Leanne the next morning. She and I had always been closer, not by design, just by personality. She was more like me, quieter, more likely to sit with a problem before reacting. I told her what Darren had said. She went very still on the phone and then she said, "Dad, I know, I'm sorry. I don't know what's happening to him." I asked her what she meant. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "Gwen's family, they kind of decide things, and Darren just goes along with it now." I said, "What kinds of things?" She said, "Things like where you sit at the wedding." I found out 2 days before the ceremony that I had been placed at a table near the back of the reception hall. Not the front, not the family table. A table near the bar where Darren's university friends and some distant cousins of Gwen's had been seated. When I asked Darren about it, he said Gwen's family had handled the seating chart and that it was a little complicated because of some tensions between relatives on her side that required careful placement. He said it wasn't personal. He said it wasn't personal. I went home that evening and I sat at my kitchen table and I thought for a very long time. Not about the seating. Not even about the money. I thought about a morning in February 2003 when Darren was 14 and had the flu badly enough that he couldn't get out of bed, and I had a major site presentation in Hamilton that I'd been preparing for 3 months. I called my project manager, told him I'd be late, drove Darren to the walk-in clinic at 7:30 a.m., waited with him for 2 hours, picked up his prescription, made him soup from scratch because he didn't like the canned kind, and drove to Hamilton at noon to deliver a presentation I'd barely had time to review that morning. I'd done all of that without a second thought, because that's what you do. I thought about that for a long time. And then I made some phone calls. The first was to my accountant, a woman named Iris, who had handled my taxes for 11 years. I asked her to pull together a complete accounting of every financial transfer I had made to or on behalf of my son over the past decade, tuition assistance when he was between jobs in 2016, the loan I gave him to cover first and last on his first apartment, $4,800, never repaid. The car repair I'd covered in 2019 when his transmission failed and he didn't have the money, $2,700. The wedding contributions. The ring. The rehearsal dinner, the hockey equipment, the hockey fees, the camp fees, the school trip fees that predated all of it. Iris called me back 2 days later. The total, including an inflation adjustment on the older amounts, was $67,400. I wrote that number down on a piece of paper. I looked at it for a while, then I folded the paper and put it in an envelope. Not for any specific reason at that point, just because some things deserved to be kept. The second call I made was to a lawyer named Whitmore, a family and estate attorney I'd met years ago at a neighborhood association meeting. He was retired now, but still took the occasional consultation. I told him I needed to update my will. He asked if there was a particular reason for the timing. I said yes, but that I'd prefer not to go into details. He understood. He'd been a lawyer for 40 years. I won't tell you what I changed. Not yet. The wedding was on a Saturday in late September. The kind of day that southern Ontario occasionally offers as an apology for the winters. Clear sky, temperature around 18 degrees, a light wind that carried the smell of something that might have been apples from the orchards not far from the venue. It was genuinely beautiful. I'll give them that. I arrived alone. I wore the same dark suit I'd worn to my own father's funeral, which I realize sounds grim, but it's my best suit, and I'm 63 years old, and I wasn't going to buy a new one. I'd had my shoes polished. I'd gotten a haircut the day before. I looked, I thought, like a man who respected the occasion. Gwen's father met me at the door. His name is Douglas. Wait, no, I should not use that name. Her father's name was, I'll call him what he was to me, which is nothing more than a man who shook my hand like I was an insurance salesman who'd come to the wrong address. Firm grip, no warmth, his eyes already moving past me to someone more important. His wife smiled at me in the way that people smile when they've been briefed on a situation and had decided to be gracious about it. I thanked them for having me. I found my seat near the back, next to one of Darren's university friends, a decent young man named Patrick who worked in insurance and seemed genuinely happy to chat. We talked about the Blue Jays. We talked about the cost of housing in the GTA. Normal things. I was grateful for him. The ceremony was beautiful. My son cried when Gwen came down the aisle. I watched him, and I felt something complicated that I don't have a clean word for. Love, grief, pride, a particular kind of loneliness that you only feel in a crowd. I thought about the boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. I thought about how time doesn't warn you before it takes something away. And then the reception began. Speeches came early. Gwen's father went first and spoke for 12 minutes about family values and the importance of roots. Gwen's brother went next with a long series of inside jokes that half the room didn't follow. Then the best man, Gwen's brother, yes, the same person, made a second speech that I later learned had been planned as a surprise. More inside jokes, more laughter from the inner circle. Then my son stood up. I've gone over his words many times since then. I have them memorized not because I try to memorize them, but because certain things simply lodge in the memory without permission. He said, I want to take a moment to thank the people who made me who I am, and honestly, that's the Hendersons. That was Gwen's family name. They took me in and showed me what family actually looks like, what it means to really be there for each other, to show up, not just financially, but emotionally, to be present. He paused there. He paused there. Be present. He paused. I also want to acknowledge my father, who contributed to the financial side of things. Dad. And he looked at me for the first time all evening. Thanks for writing the checks. Writing the checks. I heard Leanne make a small sound somewhere to my left. I found her face in the crowd. She was looking at me with an expression I recognized. The same expression she'd had at 12 years old when a teacher said something unfair and she was trying to decide whether to cry or not. I stood up. Not dramatically. I didn't flip a table or raise my voice. I simply stood up, straightened my jacket, and walked to the head table. The room watched. People always watch when the script goes off schedule. I stopped next to my son. He looked up at me with an expression that I can only describe as uncertain. The first real uncertainty I'd seen on his face all day. I leaned down. I placed the envelope on the table in front of him, and I said quietly enough that only he could hear me, "This is yours now." Then I turned and walked back to my seat. He opened it while I was still walking. I know because I heard the silence change. That particular quality of silence that happens when a room doesn't understand what it's witnessing, but knows it's witnessing something. He read the page. Then he read it again. Then he looked at me across the room. The envelope contained two things. First, the accounting from Iris, the full record of $67,400. Not as a bill, not with any demand attached, just the number, itemized, with dates. So he would know. So he could never later tell himself or anyone else that he hadn't known. And second, a single paragraph from Whitmore, printed on his legal letterhead, summarizing the change to my estate. Darren's name was no longer in my will. Leanne had been informed and had agreed, My estate, the house, the retirement savings, the investments, would go to her entirely upon my death, with a portion designated to a youth engineering mentorship program at McMaster University that I'd been involved with for years. It was all legal. It had been signed and witnessed 3 weeks prior. I didn't expect what happened next. Gwen's mother said something to Gwen. Gwen looked at the papers and then at her mother. Her mother said something that made Gwen's father push back his chair. Darren was just sitting there with the papers in his hands, very still, in the way that people go still when their understanding of their own situation has just been revised without their consent. Then Gwen stood up and she said, loudly enough that the room heard, "You're doing this now, here, at my wedding." I said calmly from across the room. He thanked me publicly. I'm acknowledging it publicly. Someone near the back laughed, not meanly, just the involuntary kind, when the tension breaks in an unexpected direction. Darren didn't say anything for a long time. The band, somewhere in the room, started tuning instruments, unaware or indifferent to what was happening. A server appeared and then disappeared. Patrick, next to me, picked up his water glass and looked at the ceiling with the careful neutrality of a man who has decided this is none of his business and is absolutely right. It was Leanne who eventually broke it. She came and sat next to me and said nothing, just put her hand over mine on the table. That was enough. I stayed for another hour. I ate the meal. Chicken with a mushroom sauce, quite good actually, and a wild rice pilaf that I thought was excellent. I drank 1 glass of wine. I spoke to a few people I'd met over the years through Darren. A couple from his old workplace who were warm to me, a woman who had been in his hockey cohort and remembered me from coaching. Normal conversations. Pleasant ones. When I left, I said goodbye to Darren. He was standing near the bar, not drinking, just standing. He looked like a man who had spent the evening reconsidering several things at once. I put my hand on his shoulder and I said, "I love you." That has not changed. He didn't respond right away. His jaw moved like he was trying to find words and couldn't locate the right ones. I didn't wait. I put on my coat, said goodnight to Gwen's parents with genuine politeness, because that was their daughter's wedding and whatever happened between me and my son had nothing to do with them, and I walked out into the September night. The drive back to Burlington took 55 minutes. I listened to CBC radio. There was a program about climate change and the Great Lakes that I found genuinely interesting. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I felt something that I want to be careful about naming correctly. It wasn't happiness. It wasn't satisfaction in the sharp, triumphant sense. It was something quieter and more durable than that. It was the feeling of having been precise, of having measured carefully and acted accordingly. I went inside, made a cup of tea, and sat at the kitchen table. Darren called me 11 days after the wedding. He was back from the honeymoon. They'd gone to Portugal, which I thought was a good choice. He called on a Thursday evening, which is not when he usually calls, and when I answered he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Dad, can I come over?" I said yes. He came the following Saturday morning. He sat at the same kitchen table where I'd written his grade 10 math out slowly so he could follow each step. He looked tired, not vacation tired, the other kind. He had a cup of coffee, and he didn't speak for a while, which I respected. I've always believed that people should be allowed to find their own way to the thing they need to say. What he said eventually was this: "I've been thinking about February 2003. I looked at him. He said, "I don't know how I remembered the month, but I did. You had that big presentation, and you took me to the clinic and you made soup and you drove to Hamilton." He paused. "I never thanked you for that." I said, "You were 14. He said, "I'm 34 now." I didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything to say that would improve on it. We talked for 3 hours that morning. Not everything was resolved. Things like that don't resolve in a single morning. There were things he said that I'll need more time with. There were things I said that probably landed harder than I intended. Gwen's name came up several times and neither of us handled it perfectly. Real conversations rarely arrive with clean edges. But when he left, he hugged me at the door. A real hug, not the sideways kind that people do when they're already mentally moving toward their car. He held on for a moment. I stood in the doorway and watched him drive away, the same as I'd done every time since he was 17 and first had keys of his own. Same driveway, same November light, grey and flat and honest. Same feeling of letting someone you love go back out into the world and trusting that what you gave them was enough. Whether I change the will back, that question people ask me when I've told this story. Leanne asked me too. The answer is that I don't know yet. That decision will be made when it's ready to be made, not before. I spent 34 years moving on other people's schedules, and I'm done with that particular habit. What I do know is this. The morning after Darren's visit, I went out to the backyard with my coffee before the neighbors were awake. It was cold enough that I could see my breath. The same maples that had been saplings when I moved in were bare now, and the frost had done something to the light that made everything look very clear and exact. I stood there for a while, not thinking about anything in particular, just standing in my own backyard in my own silence, on my own terms. 63 years old, and that was the first morning in a long time that felt entirely like mine. I think about that backyard a lot. The frost on the grass, the bare maples, the coffee going cold in my hands because I'd stopped paying attention to it. 63 years old, and that was the first morning in a long time that felt like it belonged entirely to me. Not because I'd won something. I'm not sure winning is even the right frame for what happened. It's more that I'd finally stopped pretending a cost didn't exist just because I love the person creating it. That's the thing nobody tells you about being a parent or a person who loves people deeply. The pretending accumulates. You tell yourself it doesn't matter that your name wasn't in the speech. You tell yourself the seating chart was just logistics. You absorb one small diminishment after another, and you call it grace, when sometimes it's just avoidance wearing grace's clothing. I did that for years with Darren, and the honest truth is I don't blame him entirely for what happened at that wedding, because I had taught him, through my silence, that I could be treated that way without consequence. That's the part that sat with me hardest after he left on that Saturday morning. Not what he said at the reception, not even the money. It was the recognition that consequences are a form of respect, that by never letting him feel the weight of his choices, I had quietly told him his choices didn't carry weight. A man who raised me would have called that poor parenting. He might have been right. What I did with that envelope wasn't cruelty. I want to be clear about that, even to myself. It was the first honest thing I'd done in our relationship in about a decade. Honesty that costs you something, delivered at the moment it's most inconvenient. That's not revenge. That's just finally meaning what you say. The $67,400 wasn't a bill, it was a mirror. I held it up so he could see what I had actually been, versus the story he'd been telling himself and his in-laws about me. What Darren did with that mirror is still being decided. The Saturday morning visit mattered. February 2003. The fact that he remembered, the fact that he brought it up himself without me prompting it. That told me something real was still there underneath everything that had accumulated. Wisdom isn't a thing you either have or don't. It's something you arrive at, usually the long way around, usually after you've already caused some damage. He's 34. He has time if he chooses to use it. For my part, I know this. I spent 34 years being present in every way that counts. Early mornings, late evenings, clinic waiting rooms, arithmetic at the kitchen table, hockey arenas in February, cold. And that record doesn't disappear because someone gave a bad speech. Integrity isn't what other people acknowledge. It's what you did when no one was watching and no one thanked you. I know what I did. I kept the receipts, literally and otherwise. Leanne came by the following Sunday and we had dinner. She made a roast chicken, which she's always been better at than me. We talked about her work, about the neighborhood, about her mother briefly, gently, the way you handle something old and fragile. She didn't ask about the will, and I didn't bring it up. Some things get decided when they're ready. The maples will have their leaves back by spring. I'll have my coffee in the backyard, the same as always. And whatever comes next, with Darren, with the estate, with all of it, I'll meet it the same way I met a site problem with a bad foundation, carefully, without panic, with everything I know brought fully to bear. That's all any of us can do, really. Show up, pay attention, don't flinch from the cost of the truth.